In this video, I'm going to go over some tips with working with resin. I know that if you're brand new to resin, it can be a little bit intimidating to think you have this short window of time to work with resin. But you also have a lot of time dedicated to the painting of your art. So at this step, we want to be really sure that we know what we're doing and that we take all of the steps that we need to take to have a successful resin pour. So I'm just going to take you through step by step what I like to do. And the first thing that I will say to you is watch this video and maybe make yourself a list of the things that you want to have out on your resin table, that you want to have ready to go. You don't want to be partway through pouring your resin and then find out that there's something in a completely different room that you need. The other thing that I would recommend if you're brand new to doing resin, start out just doing one piece, start out doing small pieces, just for the first few pours, just until you get a little bit of a feel for what you're doing. It's very simple to do. It's not difficult, but there just are kind of a lot of different little things to be thinking about. So start small. I always use KS resin. KS resin is a 1-to-1 pour. So you use 1 part of the liquid resin and 1 part of the hardener. And I order mine directly from KS resin. Resin does have a shelf life. So I always feel like when I order from KS resin that I get the best, freshest resin that I can get. With KS resin, you will want to keep an eye out for their sales. They have a nice sale every holiday. So now that I've got my resin, I always, whenever a holiday comes, I'm watching for those sales and I get more if I'm running low. So when you're pouring resin, you want to go to whatever manufacturer you're using, go to their website. Most of them have a resin calculator where you can put in the size of your piece. If you're just getting started with resin, I really recommend that you stay either with KS resin. Art resin is also very good. They're made for this kind of application. They're not smelly. They don't have a lot of fumes and things like that. So they're just really nice to work with for adding resin to your art. So I like to have a very simple schedule when I pour my resin. Do it in order so that you don't get confused along the way of what you've done. So with my resin, I always pour the resin first, and then I pour the hardener. And when I'm pouring just small amounts for small pieces, I pour just in 1 cup. And once this video is loaded, I'll be coming back in and giving you some links. I really like these little cups. I've never had any problem with these little disposable cups. I'm a saver, so I always wipe them out and and keep them to reuse them. But I pour in 1 container. I've always worried that if I poured resin into 1 cup and then hardener into another cup and then poured them together, that there would just be enough left over in the cup that it would make my measurements wrong. However, if you're pouring a big piece, particularly for big pieces, double check your resin measuring cup. So to do that, this cup is an 8-ounce cup. I would get 2 of these cups out, put 4 ounces of water in one, put 4 ounces of water into the second one, pour them together, and see if it equals 8 ounces. I've used these cups enough that I trust them, but I know on a big piece, the big white barn piece that I did, that is now loaded and available at Shelly Parker Art on our Patreon channel, With that one, I needed much more resin, and I was really glad that I double checked because the cup was just off enough that I worried about it. And particularly for a big piece where you've put that much of an investment in painting it, you really want to double check those measurements and make sure they're right. So for the small pieces, if I'm just doing up to 8 ounces, I just pour it in 1 cup. So I would pour 1 part of the resin, and then I would pour the second part of the hardener. And I always do it in that order so that I'm never confused as to what's already in the cup. I've had other students who have said, oh no, I think that my resin didn't set. I wonder if I accidentally poured 2 parts of resin instead of 1 to 1. So if you have that schedule, if you kind of have that habit, you have a less of a chance of making a mistake like that. So when you're pouring into your cup, you want to get down eye level with it, really check to make sure that you have just right on the line of what you're measuring. Same with the hardener. Really get down, really look at it to make sure you're as precise as you can be. If you're measuring them both in the same cup, pour slowly and make sure that you don't overpour. Of course, once you pour too much, you can't go back if you have it all in the same cup. So once you have, I will go back a little bit and just talk for a second about if you go to KS Resin and you look at their art calculator, the resin calculator, sometimes it'll say you need 5.56 ounces or something like that. I always measure even numbers of my resin. So if I went to KS Resin and for instance, it said I needed 5.5 ounces of resin, I would always mix 6 ounces. And I always have little molds. I have certain favorite ones that I like, but it's a great way to use up your extra resin. Here's the little goldfish that I did in that mold. But I would rather have too much than too little. Again, just because taking the time to stop, remix, remeasure, do all of that process is kind of a pain. So I don't mind having a little bit of extra resin, but I always pour even amounts. I don't try to eye anything in between the markings on the cup. So once you've got your resin poured into your cup, then you're going to begin to mix. I like to use the silicone coated tongue depressors. I'll look for some links and get them to this video. You could also just use a regular tongue depressor. And then you're just going to begin to mix your resin. I like to keep my stir stick, whatever I'm using, down into the cup. You don't want to add a lot of air by lifting it out a lot. And I just make sure that I'm scraping all the way around the outside, and I stir the KS Resin for 4 minutes. That's what KS Resin suggests. So again, if you're mixing, when you get to the point where you're mixing larger amounts, mix longer. Really make sure that you have all of the resin that is in your cup incorporated well. Sometimes with the resin, there's a chemical reaction that takes place when you put the 2 parts together. When you first begin to stir, you'll see that it looks a little bit cloudy. Keep stirring and it will clear up. But if you see any of those cloudy lines within the resin, it's just a good indication that it's not mixed well enough and you need to keep mixing. So once you have it all mixed, now you have about 40 minutes of time to deal with the resin. And with the white barn piece that I poured, I got close to that 40-minute mark with that. Usually 40 minutes is plenty of time, so you don't have to stress and worry at all. But as you get closer to the end of your 40-minute window, you'll notice that the resin begins to thicken up a little bit. that's kind of nice when that happens, because at that point you can be doing the little resin pours along the outside edge, kind of dome the resin over the sides. So you can still work with it. I kind of like it when it thickens a little bit toward the end. I can hit some of those areas where I want the resin to stay put a little bit better. So a couple of the tools that I like to have once I have the resin drizzled on my piece, I love these little silicone spreaders. They're great for pulling the resin around to the areas where you might not have glass and embellishments. It's a quick way to get around to the edges. It's also nice to be able to push the resin up against the frame. Sometimes the pieces that I do have a wood frame around it, so it's just a nice tool to have. The other tool that I really like to have is a wood skewer, and these are amazing. Again, you can pull the resin around to different areas, but it's also great for using the pointy part of it to pick out any lint or dust or any floating thing that you can see as the resin is set up. So the other thing that I like to use, and I just won't do resin without it, is a dedicated flashlight for my resin table. I like to be able to, let's see if I can get it into the camera here. I like to be able to point it across the surface of the resin where you can really see the shine of the resin. And that will show you if there are areas where you don't have enough resin, you need to put just a little bit more resin on it. It will also show you if maybe there's a little dust particle, or my dogs are always in the studio with me, so there's dog hair or whatever else. This is just a good thing to have, and it saved me a lot of times. So when I'm setting up my table to get ready to resin, I like to do my resin on a cookie sheet for the pieces that fit. If the piece is too big, then you can cover your work surface with a disposable tablecloth or disposable shower curtain or tarp, anything to cover the surface. Let me add in my other camera here. It did this to me earlier. It was like, for some reason, not wanting to focus on my table here. I've invested in so many different cameras and still have the trouble with it focusing. Crazy. Earlier when I lifted it up, it got better, but so what I have here is a really big oversized cookie sheet. And since it's not going to show on this camera for some reason, gosh, let me see if I lift this up, if it will focus. Okay, finally got it. So on my cookie sheet, I have it covered with sheets of parchment. This just protects the surface. I use it over and over again, so you can see little drips from past resins that I've done. But then I have these blocks so that once my resin is poured, I can cover over it with another cookie sheet, and it just keeps anything from floating down onto the surface of the resin as it's setting up. And you know, if the heater turns on or the air conditioner turns on, it's crazy how much stuff floats around. So this just sets right on top of those two wood block razors and keeps anything from landing on the surface of my resin. You can do lots of different things. This is just what works best for me. And the reason that I like the cookie sheets is because I could actually stack multiple layers. For some days where I'm pouring lots of pieces, So I could have a cookie sheet with the risers, another cookie sheet with more pieces that I'm resining and risers. And the other amazing thing is that once the resin has set up for 24 hours, I can move this cookie sheet to different places if I need to free up some workspace. So this system really works well for me. Mine have magnets on them so that the cookie sheets, if I do multiple layers for resining, the magnet that I put on top of the next layer will stick to the one underneath of it. It just makes it a little bit more stable. So on my sheet here, you can also see that I've got some different cups. These cups are used to elevate the piece that we're pouring resin on. We don't want anything that would drip off of the edge to puddle underneath of our piece. So the risers just work really well to hold it up. If anything drips, we can handle those drips, the resin drips on the back later, but at least we don't have kind of a solid puddle of resin under our piece. So these are just plastic medicine cups. I use these for another application that I use in my studio a lot. So I save them when they get too messy, and I use them as risers. You can also use just the little disposable plastic cups. You just want to make sure that as you're setting up your resin space, that it's as level as you can make it. I love these little levels from Amazon. They come in a really inexpensive set. And again, I use them in other applications that I have in my studio, but it's a great way just to make sure you want to double check. If your surface is not level, you will end up with areas on your piece where it pooled too much in one spot and pulled away from the other spot. Also, if it's not level, you'll fight a little bit more with drips along the edges. So a couple of other things I just want to point out. I love, it's falling over. Wear protection on your hands. I like these nitrile gloves. They fit just a little bit more snugly on your hands. So I've gotten some of the cheaper gloves, and they don't fit as formed to my fingers, and I find that I'm fumbling with things a little bit more. So I really like these. And again, like I said, I'm a saver, so you can see these. I've used these before. So after I finish pouring resin, I keep them to use as long as I can. The other thing that I really like are the shop towels. And they're really great for resin because the cleanup can be maybe the worst part of doing resin. So before I start, I always take my 91% alcohol, and I'll cover 2 of these shop towels just so they're handy. Then if I need to wipe off my hands, I've got a wet towel. If I need to wipe off anything that's gotten on my table, I can wipe it. Then I can also use it for cleanup on any of the tools that I use. I don't like putting my alcohol in a spray bottle because particles of that alcohol can get in the air, and I've had bad reactions and a terrible breakout of rash from that. So I just pour a little bit onto the shop towels and just have those handy. I save my cups. You certainly don't have to if that's not something you want to go through cleaning. But once I've finished with the resin, I pour a little bit of the alcohol into the cup and then wipe it out and keep my cups too. So once your resin is poured and you've checked your piece, you've shown the flashlight across it just to check to make sure that there's no areas that aren't covered enough with the resin. There's no little particles that have floated into it. Then cover it up. And I always set myself a reminder of about 30 minutes. that I come back down and check the resin. And I've found some things when I go back to check my resin. I call that babysitting your resin, and it's a good thing to do. So in about 30 minutes, come back down, carefully take the cover off of your resin, whatever you're using, and double check everything on your resin. So what I'm looking for is, has anything else floated in that I didn't see? Has anything kind of floated up that I didn't see? I'm also looking to see, in many of my pieces, I've used different pieces of glass. So I'm also looking to make sure everything stayed where I wanted it. Nothing kind of floated out and away. So it's good to double check. As I was saying that, there was something that I forgot to say earlier, and it's escaped me again. But resin is really fun. It's not difficult to do. Like I said, if you set up your space and really have everything in place, then you'll have a much better, less stressful. I don't like to be stressed and worried about something that isn't working well. So a couple of little things. When you're working with resin, make sure everything that is on your piece is completely dry. So if I've done an acrylic painting, I like to let that paint set for at least 3 days to make sure that the paint is cured and there's no moisture at all within the paint. I also like to make sure that there's no water. If I needed to use a hot water bath to take any of the bubbles out of my resin, just want to be very careful with any water. We don't want any water to get around our resin. Also, the same is true if you've used any glue or anything like that. Make sure that you have given it enough time to dry. Often I use stains on the wood frame that is around my piece. So I also make sure that that has been at least 24 hours until, before I resin it. I let it set for 24 hours just to make sure that everything is completely dry. If you are adding embellishments, you want to be aware of certain things that might bleed under resin. So if you're trying something new, it's sometimes good to do a little test. When you're doing a different pour a little bit of resin on that thing you're wondering about. Just make sure that it doesn't bleed. And now I remembered the thing that I wanted to be sure to talk about. With bubbles, once you've finished pouring your piece, you'll want to use a heat gun or a torch. I prefer to use a heat gun. I feel like I have more control over a heat gun. Let me raise mine up here. So once everything is poured, I just lightly use the heat gun over the surface. You don't want to get the heat gun down really close to your piece. So probably 6 inches, 8 inches away. Again, if you have glass or embellishments that aren't glued down, you don't want that air to push your embellishments around. But if you use the heat gun in combination with the flashlight shining over the surface, then you'll be able to see in that light if there are bubbles that are being popped. I keep the heat gun moving over the piece, and I only apply little windows of heat. So I might go over the piece once, set the heat gun down, wait 5 minutes or so while I'm cleaning up or moving things around, and then I'll come back in and use the heat gun over it again. I try to do this as few times as possible. There's been some talk that applying too much heat may cause yellowing of the resin quicker, so I try to be very careful. The only mistake that I've ever made with resin was from overheating with the heat gun. So you want to be very, very careful with that part. If you have an area of bubbles in your piece that is really bothering you, just take the skewer that we talked about before and stir in the resin in that little spot where you're seeing those bubbles, and then apply a little bit of heat from the heat gun over that. Something about the stirring makes it easier for the heat gun to pop those bubbles. But it's easy for us to be perfectionists when we are doing something like resin, and I hope that you'll be able to embrace some of those little things. Bubbles happen, and a few small bubbles probably no one but you will ever really notice or be bothered by. So don't stress too much about the bubbles. You can use a torch if you prefer to use a torch. That works really well. I work on wood substrates almost exclusively. So for me, I just prefer the heat gun. So I hope that helps. Like I said, make yourself a little checklist. You won't need it for very long, but if you're just starting out, it's nice to make sure that you've got your stirrers in place, you've got your flashlight in place, you have your wet with alcohol towels. Maybe you have a few of the extra little molds in place for any extra resin that's left over. I like to use those little pieces that I mold. I put them with orders, send them as freebies to customers that order my art. So just have everything in place. Be very careful with how you measure. Keep the moisture away, and then do that babysitting. I think maybe the babysitting is a step that a lot of people miss. Sometimes if it's a very big piece and I'm dealing with some drips along the back, I'll set another reminder and come back an hour after the resin is poured just to check it again, to make sure everything is okay. It's easier to clean off some of those drips that are along the sides. You can run the skewer along the bottom edge to clean off some of that resin drip. But it's also not impossible to remove those resin drips once it's dried. So if you want a video on how I do that, leave a comment and let me know. But if you have any questions about adding resin to your art, or if I've skipped over anything in this video, leave me a comment and let me know. All of our classes are available at Shelly Parker Art. So you can go to shellyparkerart.com and there's a link to the Patreon page there. The classes are just $9.95 a month. And we have a new project every month. And you get the tracers and the videos, the step-by-step videos on how to make the piece and permission to sell. You really get a lot with the membership. So I hope that you'll come over and join us. Our wood cutouts are available at shellyparkerart.com. We have lots of beautiful wood cutouts that add a great dimension to your art. So I hope you'll stop by. Thanks very much. Have a good day.